All right, welcome to World Building, and I'm Juliet Wade, and it appears to me that I'm echoing today, but the good news is I am actually speaking today. So, yay. Thank you very much for being here, Laura Anne Gilman, and thank you for putting up with me not being able to do the hangout last week when I was inaudible. So, why don't you start us off by telling us a bit about the Devil's West as an environment, just to sort of reacclimate us. We had a previous hangout when we talked about the first book, Silver on the Road, which is fantastic. Everybody should read it. Of course, everybody who's reading it is going to be dying to read this one. So, can you orient us a little bit to start?
Okay, the Devil's West is sort of a umbrella term that covers both this series and a number of other stories. And it focuses on an alternate history of North America, where the area that would become the Louisiana Purchase in our timeline was never acquired by either the French or the Spanish, so could never be sold to the United States in 1802, I think it was. 1803, and instead has remained an independent territory that is protected from outside pressure by an entity that is referred to as the devil, who takes the shape of a man who runs a saloon and gambling house in the town of Flood. And there is magic in the territory, although it's not spells and so forth. It's more of a natural, magical realism kind of magic, where people just kind of accept that, okay, this is how things work. You know, they accept electricity, they accept things are slightly magical. The first and second book, Silver on the Road and The Call to Eye, follow a young woman named Isabel, who grew up as an indentured servant in the devil's house. And upon reaching her 16th birthday, both her indenture ended and she's legally an adult in the territory, which means she had to figure out what she wanted to do with her life. Did she want to leave the territory, try her fortunes elsewhere? Did she want to stay in the territory? And what kind of life did she want there? Isabel is a very aggressive, ambitious young woman. She has seen that the only way to get things done is to have power and respect, because she's been watching the devil for 15 of her 16 years. So she says, I want to work for you. I see what you do. I see how you manipulate / help people. I want to be part of that. And she learns the first lesson is be very careful what you ask for, because you might get it. And instead of being handed a set job, he instead sends her out into the territory to be his left hand, which is to say, in a lot of ways, his enforcer, to make sure that people are following the rules, that if anybody needs help, she is there to provide it, if there is anything that needs to be done. But she doesn't know how she's supposed to do it. This is a learning experience for her. And she has a companion named Gabriel, who the devil basically coerces and cons into helping her. And of course, because this is a story, things go terribly wrong on a repeated basis. And Isabel has to grow from being a very smart but inexperienced child, even though she's legally an adult, to realizing that she has these responsibilities and these abilities, both her own and the ones the devil has given her, that she has to control. And it's very much a heroine's journey in that regard. She's not learning to overcome great obstacles from external sources. She's learning to use herself to deal with things in the world. And that was very much deliberate. That is a lot of what the territory is about. It's not about forcing yourself on the world, but learning to work with it. Mm. Because apparently I am incapable of writing something that doesn't have a political underpinning, or at least a socioeconomic underpinning. So that is the Devil's West. It is less traditional fantasy than it is a more overt magical realism. With magicians and monsters and yada, yada, yada.
Yeah. And also, I think it's really interesting from our previous discussion and also from it's going to be relevant to this book as well, that the magical properties are unpredictable in a way, and a little different for every creature and every thing.
Very much so. You learn more in this book. I'm trying to figure out how I can walk the line between talking about it and spoilers. You learn more in this book, and certainly the third book, about the different kind of skills that everyone has, and how they react differently to it. And you encounter some people who don't have any of those skills, but are still very much a part of the territory. People who have the skills who don't want to be part of the territory. It's not one size fits all. And a lot also has to do with how long you've lived there. Are you first generation, third generation, fifth generation, in terms of how you integrate it into your life? And there are a lot of pressures. I mean, the political pressure and the social pressure coming in from the United States. I mean, they have streetlights now. They have all of the stuff. They have universities. So there's always the appeal of quote unquote the big city across the river.
Right.
And you have to balance what's good and what's not. But it's very much, everybody has a different experience there.
And that's in the territory that they'll have a different experience. Yeah. Okay, so when you were coming up with this script, or let me rephrase that. Sometimes authors will have a really clear idea about an entire series that they want to write. And other times, a writer will write a book because they're discovering a place. And then they'll go, oh, there are more stories in this place. Do you consider yourself to be falling on one side of that equation?
Well, considering that The Devil's West was born out of a writing exercise I put my students to, which became the short story Crossroads, which has absolutely nothing to do with Isabel or Gabriel. It's set in a completely different time frame. There are a number of short stories about The Devil's West that aren't Gabriel or Isabel. So it's very much, I discovered this world. I'm not going to say it showed up full blown in my head, but it was more like I knew the outlines of it. I just didn't know all the roads. And every story I wrote, it was like discovering a new town, or discovering a new region. And for me, I've been traveling the territory along with all of my characters. Every story, there's a different aspect. There's a short story I wrote called Jack, which explores the fate of somebody who has basically bound his life to the devil, not the way Isabel has, but because he owes a debt and he now has to pay it back.
He basically sold his soul in a way,
Very
right?
much so. And the playing card motif comes up again because he is the devil's jack. The devil is playing him. He's like a card. And I didn't know that this sort of binding existed until I started writing the story. And then it became something that comes up in the books as well. The devil's jacks are everywhere. And they're kind of miserable human beings. They lead a miserable experience, but it's their own damn fault. And it's tough. You have sympathy for them at the same time you think, oh my God, you're an idiot. But these are things that I'm learning. And then what I learn about them highlights something I already knew about the world and about the characters. So yeah, very much, I guess, as I said, I know the world, but I've never actually, there are entire areas of it I haven't visited yet. Which for me as a writer is great fun because I am not limited. I mean, I'm writing Isabel's story right now and I know where for the moment it ends. But there are so many other stories. I'm working on a story right now for a Kickstarter called Boots of Clay, which is about what happens if a Portuguese Jewish community fleeing the Inquisition, and or just basically fleeing intolerance, ends up in the territory. So you have observant Jews of a particular culture living next to a native tribe, and both of them trying to get along, and for the most part doing okay, except for the fact there are these culture clashes. And this was, again, something I knew in my head because I know the history. I know that there actually were those settlers who came to the West. There were these Jewish communities that settled there, but I get to put a twist on it. And yes, it is a Golem story. The Kickstarter is Lawless Lands. I think it's got like another week or so to fund. So here's hoping.
Sure. Well, we can all go and check that out after we're done chatting.
It looks to be a lot of fun.
Tell me the title again.
Lawless Lands.
Ah, good fit for you.
Yes. The cover, I've seen the cover. It's absolutely gorgeous. So yeah, it looks to be a lot of fun. David Coe and a bunch of other writers are doing projects for it. And, but again, it's every time I get to write a new story, I know there's another novel that I want to write set in this world using all the stuff I've learned. I'm not going to do it right away because there are other things I have to get to first. The only story I think I'm never going to tell is how the devil came to the territory. I know it. I know exactly what happens. But even there, it keeps shifting in my head a little bit. And I know that if I ever put it down, I'm stuck with it. And that doesn't seem right to me for that character or that character's origin story. It should remain fluid because it's everybody else's view of it. The devil reflects back what we see in him. Yeah. Which is why in the first book, people noted that he changes what he looks like on a regular basis, even to the same person. He's shifty.
So having his history be shifty would actually be a cool thing.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could actually build that into the story, but that would be really hard.
Yeah. Well, it's always there in my head. Like I said, the fact that the territory is not a set thing. Even what people think of as the rules and the quote unquote the agreement that allows everyone to coexist isn't a set thing. There is no codified, this is what you must do. It's more of an agreement that, thou shalt not be shitty. Pretty much. And the devil's left hand decides if you're being shitty or not. But that is open to her interpretation. And that's something that she's having to learn. That's something that the reader is learning. And there's also a huge cost to that.
I'm over here taking notes.
There is no, it's funny because other projects I've worked on, there are Bibles of how everything works. And I'm very logical about how the magic works. Retrievers, I still have so much crap in the back of my head about weather and electricity from when I was creating the magic system. For the Vinart War trilogies, I knew every single aspect of how the magic worked. I did months of research and had everything down. This one, it's more like I've got a pretty good idea of what powers the magic, but it's not really something that can be codified in that sense. And that's intentional because it is very much an organic thing that resists being identified, especially by the science of that time. So there's a lot of elasticity in it. I've never thought of it that way before. There's a lot of elasticity in the magic or the medicine of this world. And that's been an interesting thing. I've tried very hard to avoid the use of the word magic. It's a pejorative almost. When I can, where it's appropriate, I've used medicine or power or abilities, skills, that kind of thing, but not magic.
So you have the word magic deliberately assigned as a pejorative word in the context of the world?
Well, that's how a lot of people use it because that's how it's seen outside of the territory. In this time frame, it's not that far from the witch hysteria.
Right.
And there's science is coming to predominance, but there's still a lot of superstition and whatnot. So it's not seen as a positive or a good thing. So most people just don't use it.
I think you said to me that the approximate year was like 1810?
1802.
1802, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been interesting
that I have that written down for this particular discussion.
1801 to 1803 is the time frame. Jefferson has just been elected president. In the second book, we get to see some stirrings of that. Basically, all of the politics outside the territory are, as best I can do, the exact politics that were happening at that time.
Well, that's interesting.
Which has been fun. But I had a thought, lost it. Okay. But 1801, 1802, which is interesting time frame to work with, because most people hear Weird West and they think, oh, Old West. Capital O, capital W, gunslingers, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
This is before rifled barrels. They're using flintlocks. Very advanced flintlocks, very sophisticated flintlocks. But the carbines that Gabriel carries are single shot for the most part. They're blunderbusses. They are not really, there are no hip-slung pistol work here. And so there's all of that I had to take into account when I was writing conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Fights here are much more likely to be solved with fists, even than knives, and much less guns, which was an interesting challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And I think threw a lot of readers at first.
Yeah, but anytime your expectations are defeated, you're going to end up struggling with it a little bit, right?
Well, that's why we didn't originally want to call it a Weird West. My editor and I referred to it as an American fantasy.
Yeah.
That's how it was presented to the sales force, I believe. But marketing needed a tag, and American fantasy they didn't think would sell, so Weird West it was. And it is weird, and it is the West. So.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, it doesn't have a lot of the expected prototypical features of
no gunslingers, no prostitutes. Well, there's implied prostitution, but that's just kind of like one of the things that they do to pass the time. No railroads, very low tech.
Yeah, because railroads are a big feature of Wild West too.
Yeah. And it's always been interesting doing research in this time period, because if you're east of the Mississippi around that time, there's a lot of information.
Yeah.
And you cross the Mississippi prior to 1801, and all of the history is A, oral, and B, in a language that is not commonly spoken. It's all tribal history.
Yeah.
So the only access I had was the people who would tell me stories. And I did get to hear an awful lot of stories, an awful lot of mythology from various tribal storytellers. But the histories themselves are couched in language and storytelling styles that are so different from what we, reading and speaking English, have been raised in.
Yes.
That it's really difficult to translate it. And I've tried to make use of that when things are kind of nonlinear or don't quite seem to make sense in the world. It's because I'm trying to play with that. This very different sense of time, of storytelling, of logic. I don't know how well I do it, but that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
And yes, somebody said before that the prostitutes always seem to play a very, very large role in Weird West. And that's kind of why I went, I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
It's not part of this. I mean, sex for pay is always going to be part of any world, especially when you've got a gender disparity. but that's not part of the culture there, really.
Yeah. So, you describe your interaction with this world as a process of discovery, and I think that's awesome. It kind of rings a bell for me because I have a world that I explore too, which is great. Are there any places where you I'm gonna say, okay, I'm gonna use the exploration metaphor. Are there any places where you went into a region and you didn't know what was there and you had to kind of push hard to extrapolate from surrounding things or create what was in that spot?
Oh, you just described book 3.
Tell me a little about that.
Book 3, they're moving south, so they're actually in what would have been Louisiana. And it's a completely different territory, different landscape, both physically and socially, than the high plains and the mountains that they had been traveling before. The Caddo Confederacy, and I always want to say Caddo Conspiracy, the Caddo Confederacy was at the time a grouping of very small tribes along the delta and along the Mississippi, who banded together as protection, both against larger tribes and encroaching across the Mississippi. By the time this story actually takes place, a lot of those tribes had disappeared.
Yeah.
They either were absorbed into another tribe by marriage or conquest. They died out for whatever reason. And there was no information.
Yeah.
So I've had to extrapolate, and I've had to work with best guesses. And this is also, the third book is also the only book where the tribal names that I'm using are not necessarily the actual tribal names that the tribes themselves used. Because we don't know them, all of them.
I see.
And I don't want to use the modern terms because I haven't up until now.
Right.
So it's been a lot of, and at the same time, of course, I couldn't do my usual on-the-ground research because the month I was supposed to go do research is when they had all the terrible flooding.
Okay.
And one does not go into a danger zone just to do research. That's a good way to get yourself killed.
Yeah.
Or at the very least called an idiot, and rightfully so. So there was a lot of frustration there, having to rely on second-person narrative, other people's photos. I think I got past it, but it was frustrating. One of the other stories I want to tell of this particular period would actually take me up into Alaska. Because the Russians had such a huge presence there, and it's really a part of the territory that hasn't been explored yet. And there I know exactly, what I will find, and I'm looking forward to it. I just have no idea when I'm going to get to do it.
Yeah. Well, at least you'll have the good research material.
And a hell of a lot easier to get there from Seattle than it was from New York.
Oh, yeah, I could say. Okay, so tell me a little bit about raising the stakes between book 1 and book 2. That's typically a thing that happens. Did you find yourself, what was the process like there? I mean, you've got 3 books. I'm guessing that you kind of have an idea of what the story is like. How do you control, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, how do you control the stakes, how they get raised, how to keep them from getting raised so far that you have to blow the top out of your world? That kind of a question.
For me, the answer for that is actually pretty simple for me in this particular series, because these stakes have always been the same for the territory: survival. That is consistent through all of the stories. It is always, every single day, they are being pressured. There is the United States that has manifest destiny on its mind. There is Spain that desperately needs territory. All of these things that are happening. So those stakes are consistent. The stakes of each story are what Isabel has to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
And the jump from book one to book two is book one, she had no idea what she'd gotten herself into and was having to discover what it was, what she was supposed to do, who she was supposed to be. In book two, she has to deal with what she's become. She's no longer this innocent child. She's no longer even a teenager. She has become an adult through sheer pressure on her, the same way the territory has pressure on it. And she has to make decisions that a book ago, she could not have made. She wouldn't have known how, she wouldn't have been able to do it. And in book three, she has to deal with the results and the fallout and the inevitable evolution from that. And each time we see her, she's having to deal with, I'm not gonna say she's getting darker, because that's not who she is, but she has more weight on her.
Right.
And more history. And she has to integrate and deal with that and sometimes not deal with that.
Yeah.
Okay, I think there was a question that came up.
Sure.
Trying to see the side notes there.
Look in the chat bar, which
is okay, there we go. Do I foresee going past the 3 books?
With Isabel specifically, Jay, do you mean, or?
I guess either one, with the character from this one, or starting like another series with a different character.
At the end of book 3, Isabel has reached a point where pretty much her apprenticeship ride is done. And that is where I'm pausing for the moment. I do have other stuff in mind. I don't know whether that's going to be a novel or a novella, though. It hasn't really gelled in my mind yet. And a lot obviously will depend on what Saga, my publisher, wants going forward. I know that there's been talk about other things, other projects. I do intend to keep writing about the territory. There's an awful lot of stories that I want to tell. I may get around to telling the story of how Marie became the right hand, because that's one that I have notes on. Maybe even a story just about Flood itself. But there's so many characters that I cannot see myself not writing more about this world, because I don't know it all yet. I haven't explored it all yet. And there are so many different points of view. We've only seen 2 points of view between Gabriel and Isabel, but there are so many more. I can see it. I can see it going on for a while.
Well, I hope that you'll be able to extend it, because that would be really awesome. Okay, so let me think about. I wanted to see if I could get you to talk a little bit. You kind of gestured at it a minute ago, but talk about some of the different kinds of cultural clashes that you are taking into bringing into the story. I'm noticing, for example, that right at the start of The Cold Eye, you've got a mixed race family. And that seemed like a really interesting thing to me. And I'm sure that was going on constantly. And yeah, talk about, the kinds of different communities that you wanted to particularly look at, or how those people came to come into your books, for example.
Well, a lot of it, I mean, again, history background, American history background, I was aware of the fact that our overall idea of the West as being Western European settlers coming in from the East Coast isn't actually the full story.
Right.
There were settlers coming in from Spain and Portugal. There were the French who were coming down from Canada, the trappers who came and stayed.
Uh-huh.
There are all the various native tribes who are completely different cultures from one region to another.
Yep.
And that constant sort of turmoil is fascinating to me. Again, as I mentioned before, there were Jewish communities that came out west.
Yeah.
A lot of them later, but still, escaped slaves, folks coming up from South America. There was a constant flow. It's just that we've learned about the westward movement from the east,
Right.
to the extent of everything else. So what I really wanted to do was show that, I mean, first of all, you have the isolationists. They're the people who, for whatever reason, wanted to be as far away from everyone else as possible. These are people who say, yeah, let's go to Idaho, go up in the mountains and not see anybody for 4 months at a time. They wanted their little outpost, and they don't want to be bothered, and they don't want to deal. Then there are the people who really want to create a city. They want all the best of civilization while still being out in the territory. There are the farmers who want both. We've got the start of the herding communities and the cattle communities, which are touched on briefly in Silver on the Road. So what you've got the conflict that's coming up between farmers and ranchers. Again, as you mentioned, there's the conflict between what happens when you get families that are, people that are marrying outside of their own culture. Which culture do they belong to? Which culture actually wants them? And what they'll accept one or two of, will they really accept 10 or 20 of?
Right.
Because that's when you have one or two coming in, it's kind of like, oh, okay, fine, we'll take them in, no problem. But when you suddenly look around and realize that your quote unquote culture is being diluted from whichever point of view, that's when real conflict shows up. So I'm definitely playing with that in the second book. In the third book, you get a lot of who gets to determine the future. I was very angry writing the third book. As much as I try not, I mean, I always had a political view for these books, but as much as I tried really hard to keep it to the historical, the modern inevitably got in. But I try very hard to see all of my characters' point of views. None of them are, by their lights, bad people. It's what they want, what they need,
right,
for the territory to become. I just get to, as the world creator, I get to see which one of them, those choices, leads to a bad road and which one leads to a better road.
Yeah.
Okay, and there was another question. No, I have not watched Hell on Wheels.
Oh, okay.
Is it on cable?
It was on AMC, and you can catch the whole thing on Netflix.
Netflix, okay, yeah, because I don't have cable, so I miss out on a lot of stuff.
Yeah, no, it's been on Netflix for a while. It's about the building the railroads.
Yeah. And there was an awful lot of fascinating material once the tracks started getting laid, between the cultures that were coming in and the resistance and the people who really wanted it. Yeah. And the graft, the corruption.
Yeah. So does the early history of California as independent from Mexico come into the time frame here at all?
Not as far as I'm aware of yet.
Yeah, I think it's a little too early for that.
Yeah. Pretty much. Oh, that's a spoiler.
Sorry.
I know what happens to the territory, and I know more or less when it happens. So most of my stories until now have been set well before that time.
Uh-huh.
I'm not sure I want to write those stories because it's really complicated, and I'm not sure I have the energy to do that right now.
Yeah.
But there does come a time where the piper has to be paid by everybody. Nothing gets to stay the same. Nothing gets to stay intact. And by nothing, I mean absolutely nothing.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of what history's like, right?
Pretty much, yeah. One thing I've tried really hard in these books is to be faithful to the actuality of history, not the events of history, but what history is. And that's why a lot of times people are like, well, there wasn't really any big climactic battle in the end. I'm like, because honestly, that's very rarely is there a
very few of those in history.
Something happens and you deal with it, and then you look back and go, shit, that was it. That was the moment. Everything changed.
You don't know it was the moment until later, and then you were like, wait.
and I understand that for a lot of readers, this is not satisfying. They want that big build up and explosion, like, you know, as we were talking about before, the beer going everywhere. And then a wrap up afterwards. And instead, in these books, what you get is the moment and then kind of the explosion after the fact, when everybody has to deal with what happened. Because that is realistic, and that is history, and that is storytelling.
Yeah.
I've also been told that I write much more of a Asian style storytelling than a Western. I haven't done enough research to actually know whether this is true or not. But it's something that keeps niggling in the back of my brain, which is I'm not following the 3-act.
Yeah.
I'm not following a traditional journey. It's more of a bump, a bump, a bump, a bump, a bump, a bump story. Yeah, we see. I was going to say another cat has appeared.
Yeah, this is my boy cat, and as I mentioned to you, he will say, "Now it is time for love." And then
oh, he is. How old is he?
He is.
He's got an old man face.
No, he's kind of. I think he's 8. He's not super old. He's yeah. He's had problems with his eyes since he was a kitten, actually. But he's yeah. He's a sweetheart. And it's you know, it's occupation. This is when he wants his snuggles. It's occupy mom. You know.
Yeah. I normally Boomer will do that too, but he has staked. I just made the bed, so he has staked it out, and it is his for the rest of the day.
So now my note taking is going to slow down. This is really cool, Laura Anne. I love this world. I can tell that you love it. I know why, because it's just so incredibly rich. And there's so many opportunities for stories. I mean, I think in a way that its resemblance to actual world history is one of its biggest strengths, and one of the things that makes it so full of stories that you could dip into.
Well, history is the best storytelling. People are always like, well, you know, do you think a writer should be an English major? I'm like, no, you should be a history major or a pol-sci major. Because that's where the really good stories are.
Be an anthropologist and linguist, but you know, it's one of those things. There are a lot of good skills that come into it.
But I think they're all related. I mean, it's looking back at what people did and why did they do it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's storytelling. That's how you learn storytelling, not by studying sentence structure.
Right.
That's mechanics.
Yeah.
Studying how another writer told a story. Those are the mechanics. That's not what teaches you how to tell a story.
Right.
Right now, my English professors are all rising up going, but all my history professors are going, that's right. I had a double major, English and history, so they yelled at me a lot. But I really think that history and political science and anthropology, all of the soft sciences that look at people, cultures, decision making, why did they do that? Is the best way to learn how to tell stories.
Yeah.
you may be telling other people's stories, but that's still, you're interpreting what was done and putting a spin on it through your own head. That's storytelling. That's why the best nonfiction books have that storytelling bent to them, rather than just being recitation of dry facts.
Yeah.
It makes it something that we can take in much more easily.
Yeah.
And I just went off on a rant there, didn't I?
No, it's great. That's the kind of rant
I have strong
we
feelings
enjoy.
about the liberal arts and sciences having to be taught together.
Yes. No, and I am right with you on that. And in fact, I'm personally in my writing, I'm very much on the sort of science borderline. I never thought I was writing science fiction for a very long time. I thought I was writing fantasy. And then I sold something to analog and I was like, oh.
You're an analog writer. Yes, therefore you must be a science fiction writer. I came so close to an analog sale once. They gave me an Analog Mafia button in sympathy.
That's awesome. Yeah, I have a button. They are pretty awesome.
Yeah, and I'm not a science fiction writer. I just tend to get a lot of science in my fantasy. Actually, it's not true. I've written science fiction short fiction. It's just not the novel length. And I should say yet. Who knows? I figure I still have another 20, 30 years of writing. I could do a lot of things in that time.
Yeah. I think, in fact, I've spoken to a lot of really neat people on the show. I'm a very lucky person. And I think that the people who have the most compelling worlds are the people who really have a lot of science grounding in their fantasy. And I'm thinking about people like Ken Liu and N.K. Jemisin and yeah, quite a number of people who have said to me, oh yes, I've got to have a lot of science in my fantasy. But you know what? It's and I think Stina Light too, like, you know, these folks really care about the kind of grounding that they have for their fantasy. And I think in a way, the more unmoored you're going to be in some areas of your fantasticality, right? The more important it is to be grounded in other areas, and science is really the best skill.
Well, I always tell people there are two different kinds of suspension of disbelief. There's a suspension of disbelief that the reader brings, which is basically coming into a story and saying, all right, I'm going to trust you. Therefore, I'm going to accept certain things as given if you tell me that they are given. And I will not blink or throw myself out of the story when we come to these things. But there's also the suspension of disbelief that the writer has to bring, which is our obligation to create a scaffolding, a structure upon which the reader can hang their suspension of disbelief. And that means that you have to have the real shit real. So that when they come to something that is not real, they accept it because you have laid down that structure so well, they can rest on it and say, I trust this because it feels as real as the stuff that is real.
Right.
I mean, when I was writing The Cold Eye, a lot of what happens there it's I almost said triggered off of, it starts because of an earthquake. And if I didn't just earworm everyone, I didn't do my job right. But I'm a geology minor. I mean, that was my science background. And I went back through all of my texts and I did additional research. And at the time when I was coming up with this book, I was dating a seismologist, which, yay for immediate research. Sweetie, tell me this.
Yeah, that's always helpful.
Yes. So I was able to take actual facts and then twist them just slightly, but that slight twist, they still feel real. I was able to shift things from where they actually happened to where I needed them to happen. But because I kept the basics of why they happened intact, hopefully people aren't even going to blink at that.
Well, you know, in a way, I would say that suspension of disbelief requires effort. I mean,
both parts, yeah.
It's not even just as, because we think about, well, I'm just going to relax into the story and let it happen. But at the same time, it requires an effort to to put certain kinds of expectations aside, right? And so if you by providing the grounding, by making things as close to real as possible, you're sort of taking a lot of the weight off of that effort that's required to keep believing in the story.
Well, yeah, it's as I said, the reader comes in saying, "Okay, I'm willing to give you benefit of the doubt. I am willing to enter your world because you created it and you're my guide." I mean, that's why we refer to being thrown out of a story rather than walking out of a story.
Mm-hmm.
You're going along, and all of a sudden you hit something, and it just boom throws you out.
Yeah.
And our responsibility to not allow those stumbling points to happen, to not create those ejection points. And that definitely, I was just before we started this call, I was working with a client, an editorial client, and I was dinging her on a number of points where I'm kind of like, there's no logic behind this. I mean, it looks good, it sounds good, but it doesn't connect to the stuff you did previously. And it has to, because the moment she's writing a mystery, I said, the moment you have something that doesn't connect logically, your reader's going to stop and go, but why?
Yeah.
And the moment they stop to say, but why, you've lost them.
Oh, and I think the demands of mystery are very, very
stringent.
Oh,
yeah. And this was their first attempt at a mystery, and I think they knew it, but they hadn't quite internalized it yet. So that's what we spent a lot of time going over exactly where it needed to be internalized.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Here we are at the end of our hour, and I know you have places to be. So I'm going to say thank you so much for being here. Che, any last minute questions, thoughts?
Well, I put in the chat, you probably missed it because I'm the only one in the chat, is that it sounds like your style is more picaresque.
Very much so. I joke that my mother grew up reading the incredibly depressing Russians, whereas I tend to go more towards the quirky Mexicans.
Yeah.
And I definitely was influenced by both the traditional picaresque, both Spanish and Mexican, and the Latin American magical realism, far more so than some other styles. I'm not sure I realized how much until I started writing these books, though. And I think my agent actually had to point it out to me. It's like, I was like, but this doesn't have that. And he's kind of like, yeah, but you're doing this. I went, you're right. Yeah.
Things you are doing without realizing you are doing.
Well, 90% of storytelling is getting out of your own way and just letting it happen and then fixing it later.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, if I had stopped to think about what I was doing stylistically, I would have panicked. I mean, even more so than I actually did. Writing Silver on the Road was an exercise in constant panic because I was doing something so different than what I'd done before. When I was writing Cold Eye, I was kind of like, okay, people kind of like this, so let's try and do it again, only better. And then for the third book, it was, okay, now you got to go up another level, but no stress. But yeah, once it was pointed out to me that it was not just the fact that I was writing a road story, but that I was writing a very particular kind of road trip story.
Yeah.
Things coalesced a little bit better in my brain.
Cool. Very cool. Well, everybody go out, read The Cold Eye, because this is awesome stuff. And thank you so much for being here, Laura Anne, and flexing to my sicky schedule.
I'm glad you're feeling better.
Yeah, well, you know, it's nice to be able to talk to you. I can't underestimate that. Actually, next week, I think we're going to have another guest. Ha.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And let me take a quick look, and because I want to be able to tell you exactly who that's going to be, because I did a whole bunch of guest arranging in the last week, which is
when she couldn't talk.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yay for being able to IM people, right? I am an email. Save me. So I want to be able to tell you if my thing will ever load.
Technology.
Yeah, technology for the win, right? Well, I mean, hey, I love using this. I love using this. Oh, that's right. Okay, so next week we're going to have Fonda Lee on. And Fonda Lee is going to talk to us about a couple of books, hopefully. I mean, she has her debut novel was called Zero Boxer. And that is a very interesting, it's about what you think. It's about zero gravity boxing. Which I'm going to have to ask her at least a little bit about that. And then she has this new novel coming out called Exo, which sounds like it's going to have lots of really interesting stuff about aliens and humans and their interactions culturally. And I'm just going to geek out, and it'll be awesome. So that will be next week, Fonda Lee. And then at that point we will have another topic, and I will be able to have time to announce who the next. We have people coming. Alec Navala Lee is going to come on. Alex Delmonica is going to be coming on in the next couple of months. Lots of really cool stuff. I'm super lucky in all the nice people that I know who want to talk to me about their books. So anyway, thank you again, Laura Anne, and I'm going to stop the broadcast.
All right.